this episode, we're talking about a light, a blind man, and a shepherd. Here we go. Okay, in this episode, we are going to continue in John chapter 8. Remember that this is where the woman was just taken in adultery. It's a scene that is happening in the temple. And now Jesus continues to teach about primarily who he is. And the example that he starts off with here is the following. He says here in verse 12, "Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." A couple of things here. First of all, John is the only one of the four authors of the Gospels that gives this example of Jesus being the light in any form. Here he is, the light of the world. What does that mean? We oftentimes think as we go through the New Testament and we read about the life of Jesus that he's coming out and these are new teachings for the people that are listening, and that there's no real reference going on. Obviously, all of us would understand if someone talked about someone being the light, that they clarified things, that they could guide you with a light instead of being in darkness. Those are concepts that are obvious and simple and very true. But there is a much richer meaning to what Jesus is trying to say here. And again, keep in mind that the circumstances here are that they are in a large apostasy, and that their doctrine has changed over the centuries. And they have lost what is the idea of the real true Messiah, of the Son of God coming down and taking on the sins of the world. And so he's coming not just to teach them something new, but he's coming here to restore the truths that have been lost. And there are echoes of these teachings inside of Jerusalem and in the land of Judea, in all of Palestine and beyond. And some of these groups of Jews have held on to a lot of these truths. And others, like what they could call the Jews more often than not, the ones that are in power, have pushed them aside and kept a tradition where the law of Moses has become king, and not what the law of Moses looks forward to. And not just the law of Moses, but as with King Noah and his priests with Abinadi, that they do not follow the law of Moses. Because obviously it has no end. It has nowhere to go. It has nothing to look forward to. And they have corrupted the law and oppressed the people through additional rules that come more from the traditions of their fathers and not things that look forward to the Savior of the world. And so as he comes into this environment, he is restoring what used to be taught. And it has radically changed. So we get this idea that the Jews are there looking for this Messiah, and that they just happen to believe that it's not Jesus, but that it's somebody like him. That isn't true. They're looking for something completely different. They are not looking for the Son of God. They are not looking for Jehovah, who is a representative of the Father, to come down and take on the sins of the world. And so as Jesus comes in to proclaim who he is, and as the authors of the Gospels are testifying about who he is, they oftentimes will look back to the prophets that have all testified about Jesus Christ, about Christ coming and taking on the sins of the world, and make references to the fulfillment of these prophecies, and that Jesus is this individual that all of these prophets have talked about. And that's why in the story of the woman taken in adultery, I believe it's so crucial that we understand what John appears to be framing here, that he is the brazen serpent. It's not enough to be the Messiah. He is the brazen serpent. Who is that? That is the healer. That is the one who took on the sins of the world so that we could be healed. That is not a part of what the Jews here believe, those in power believe. Now, some may believe this. So there may be some that are hanging on to those types of traditions. We know that the community of Qumran, the Essenes that were there, they were looking forward to a different type of prophet, a Melchizedek, that is a king of peace, a second Melchizedek, who would be what Jesus Christ was fulfilling. So they had traditions, even though they may not have been the ones that recognized Jesus as this Messiah, but they had traditions and writings where they believed that a different type of Messiah was coming. Something different from what, let's call it, the mainstream or the establishment of the Jewish community, of those in power, believed. And there were numerous different sects of Jews that had different traditions. And so think about the time of Lehi. This is the major upheaval that happened when what I believe happened is that they had lost the doctrine of Christ at this time. And so as they lose this and the society devolves down into a law of Moses type of a society, and the Melchizedek priesthood is removed, and the idea that the Messiah is the savior of the world is removed, then you have these splinter groups that come apart because they're killing all the prophets. Remember, they tried to kill Lehi. And what was Lehi's sin? His sin was blasphemy. His sin was blasphemy because he was preaching about Christ. He was preaching that Jehovah was the Son of God and would come down in the flesh and take on the sins of the world. That's why they were trying to kill him in Jerusalem. And that's the excuse, more than likely, that Laman and Lemuel were going to use, or were using, to kill their own father. Blasphemy. That was the issue. And so you have these groups that splinter off. There's writings talking about 80,000 priests that left and went for Arabia and went to fight for the Babylonians, in fact, against Jerusalem. And there's all these groups. Lehi would not have been the only one. Of course, we know the Mulekites came over later on, and that they came from King Zedekiah and his lineage. And so there are all these different groups. We don't know how many of them were left behind when the Babylonians took all the Jews. Many of the Jews, who were the Jews, took them to Babylon. And then when they were returned by the king of Persia later on, Cyrus, what was already there? Who was already there? Who was in the desert? Who was in the wilderness? What mixture of tradition and religion and doctrine was already in place? And so Jesus, as he is speaking to everybody and saying who he is, and the gospel authors are trying to show who he is, they're not just giving new doctrine. They are referring back to a previous time when the prophets, especially Isaiah, were talking about the Messiah who would be the Son of God. That's crucial to understand, that he is the Son of God. And so we talk about the light. One thing you may have heard about is that during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is happening right now, there were 4 massive candelabras that would give light throughout all of the city of Jerusalem and beyond. They were huge, and they each carried 4 bowls of oil, and they were, big enough that you had to climb up ladders just to be able to get up and put the oil into the bowls to light these massive lamps, right? And so he's talking about how he is the light of the world. At night, you would have men that would dance all night with torches, giving off light. But there's something else to consider here about him being the light. And let's look at a couple of temple texts, which are the Psalms. And in the Psalms, we see here Psalm 27:1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." Remember, it's a temple text. Psalm 43:3, "Send out thy light and thy truth. Let them lead me." Lead them where? Lead them to the temple. Lead them to the Holy of Holies. It is likely that apart from just one menorah that would have been outside the veil, that inside the Holy of Holies was another large menorah that was lit. And this represented the tree of life. And the tree of life is whom? Well, it's primarily Christ. It would be, in a way, Christ and his mother Mary. That's a concept we have gone over before. But this is Christ, is the tree of life. And so when he says he is the light of the world, there is an understanding for those that would have known about the old traditions, the old understanding before the apostasy of the doctrine of Christ, what he was talking about. And John does this throughout his gospel. Remember, John was a priest. He worked in the temple through most of his adult life, more than likely. And so he makes even more than the other authors of the scriptures and the other authors of the gospels. He is really focused in on temple imagery. And so here he shows Christ talking about how he is the light of the world that would guide and lead everybody eventually through that ascension, through the temple, to the Holy of Holies. And the Pharisees might even guess what he's saying here, because in the next verse they say, "Thou bearest record of thyself, thy record is not true." And Jesus answered and said unto them, "Though I bear record of myself, yet my record is true, for I know whence I came and whither I go." And then he says here, because you need a second witness to confirm something, right, in their law. He says down in 16, "And yet if I judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone, but I and the Father that sent me." So he is adding the Father's testimony to his. Now, do the Jews believe in a heavenly Father and a Son? This is really key to understanding what Jesus is doing here. The answer is no, right? They do not believe in this anymore. This would have been part of the previous doctrine of the doctrine of Christ. It's crucial to understand that he is the Son of God. This is wiped out. It's gone. And so he's coming down here and saying, there's me, I am the Son of God, and there is my Father. Obviously, if I'm the Son of God, I need a Father. And we see that even more so here as the Pharisees come back to him and say, "Where is thy Father?" And Jesus answered, "Ye neither know me nor my Father. If ye had known me, ye should have known my Father also." And these words spake Jesus in the treasury. Kind of an interesting place here. Treasuries in the temple, understanding again of the spiritual economy that they are discussing here. And so then the Pharisees press him even further, and they say, "Who art thou?" And Jesus saith unto them, "Even the same that I said unto you from the beginning." This is interesting. Is he talking about from the beginning of their conversation, from the beginning of his teaching, or is he talking about as John opens up his gospel, in the beginning was the Word? Is he talking about in the beginning or from the beginning? Is he talking about the Son of God on his throne in the Holy of Holies? That's who I am. I don't know, but possibly here, knowing that this is John as the author. And then in verse 28, he goes and gives a reference to the brazen serpent and at what they're going to do to him when they crucify him. And he says, "When ye have lifted up the Son of Man, then shall ye know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things." Now he may say here, if you notice in this verse, he says, "Then shall ye know that I am he." The he at the end here is in italics. In the King James Version of the Bible, whenever you see italics, those are words that are inserted, they're assumed, taking it from either the Hebrew or the Greek, here the Greek. And here you could assume that there's a he, but it could just be, "Then shall ye know that I am." In other words, I am that I am. That he's making this claim about being Jehovah and the Son of God. And so this discussion about a father begins. And so then the Pharisees come back and they say, "We be Abraham's seed, and we were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be made free? Of course, they're in bondage to the Romans here, but regardless, he says that they are Abraham's seed. And Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. And then Jesus says to him, I know that ye are Abraham's seed, but ye seek to kill me because my word hath no place in you. I speak that which I have seen with my Father, and ye do that which ye have seen with your father. They answered and said unto him, Abraham is our father. And Jesus saith unto them, If ye were Abraham's children, ye would do the works of Abraham. So when he refers to the father of the Pharisees, he's referring to someone else, which is Satan. He's referring to the father of lies, is their father, because that's who they follow. And if you recall, as they refer to being the children of Abraham, remember John the Baptist would say to those that came out, the Pharisees and others that came out to hear him preach, that the stones that were around him, that he could make them as much the children of Abraham. This is the same idea here. It's just like Abinadi when he talks about God being the Father and the Son. He's talking about Jehovah. He's talking about Jesus Christ. And he specifically gives this same exact example that Jesus is giving here. That those that believe on the Son, that is how the Son then is their father, because they are his seed. So this is kind of like an example of someone being a father who the people follow. So if you follow the Son and you do the works of the Son, then the Son, Jesus, is your father in that sense. And Jesus is saying the same thing here. And so you have this whole discussion about the Father and the Son. This is such a crucial doctrine of understanding that we have in the church, that even most of Christianity does not have. That these are separate beings. There is a Father and there is a Son. And here the Jews do not believe this. And so as he claims to be Jehovah, he is not claiming to be the Father, but he has come in the name of the Father to do the works of the Father. And so a massive difference of doctrine between what Jesus is teaching them and restoring to them and what the Jews actually believe here in Jerusalem. And finally here, Jesus says to them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. In other words, before Abraham it was, and then he gives the name of God, the name that you cannot mention. I am that I am, right? And they pick up stones. There would have been, this is during a time when there was a lot of refurbishing going on in the temple. There probably were stones around in the temple. But John, again, here ends this chapter with Jesus just forthright coming out and saying, I am Jehovah. And then we move over to chapter 9 here, and John gives the story of Jesus healing a blind man. This is pretty interesting. He says here in verse 1, And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? This was a common understanding at the time, that if you had physical ailments, it is because you or your parents had sinned. And Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. It's an interesting concept. Why are there people born with deficiencies? Why are there people born with handicaps? Why are there people born into poverty? Why are there people born in difficult adversarial situations and others are not? This goes right to the heart of what maybe the largest argument of atheism is. And yet Jesus here says specifically, so that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Well, what are the works of God? Who does the works of God? Well, we do as agents. And so in the spiritual economy, you have to have people at different levels, in different ways, in a different hierarchy of poverty, a different hierarchy of intellect, a different hierarchy of spirituality, a different hierarchy of health. Because if you don't, there is no way for any of us to grow. right? So someone may be at a high level of intellect and economy, financial economy, but they may be at a lower, very low level spiritually. Or they may be at a very low level with their health. Everybody has got to have challenges in a certain way. Number one, for us to struggle and grow and learn and to be humble, right? We're given weaknesses so that we can be humble. And the other reason is for those that may be at a higher level in that specific way, that they can reach out and offer and be agents of God to help you, that person, grow and to lift them up with them. You have to have that, different levels of different things all the time. This idea of having a flat hierarchy in everything is not the plan of God. It doesn't work that way. Not until there is a perfection of utopia, so to speak. But if we're trying to flatten out everything forcefully without going through what we all need to go through individually to lift everybody up and to be lifted up by others, until we're able to do that, you've got to have people in different situations. Fairness is not the plan of God. Fairness doesn't work. It robs all of us from humility, and it robs all of us from being able to offer charity to others. That is not the plan of God. And here Jesus gives this example that we should all follow. He says, I must work the works of him that sent me. So we're all supposed to be doing this, lifting somebody else up, trying to heal others, whatever their ailment might be. And then he goes back to the light here. He says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So it's leading everybody forward to that celestial room, to leading everybody forward to the Holy of Holies. And when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed and came seeing. And so they all come to him and they say, how are your eyes opened? How did this happen? They want to prevent a problem here, another miracle that has been brought to Jerusalem. They've got a problem. The Pharisees and the Jews have got a problem here. And he says in verse 11, a man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes and said unto me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. And of course, it's the Sabbath, which is always an issue. We're not going to cover that here. And then they ask him, this is again another issue of collectivism, of shame, and of influence, of negative influence. They ask him, what sayest thou of him? So there's definitely pressure here. You can imagine the tone of their voice, of this inquisition that is happening with this now previous blind man and what they are trying to extract from him. What sayest thou of him? That he hath opened thine eyes? He said, he is a prophet. So the blind man is testifying of Christ here. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? And his parents answer, and they say, he has always been blind. But they don't say by what means he was cured, and they're not willing, for fear of being cast out, probably in a sense being excommunicated, is what they're looking at, to be cast out from the synagogue. They're afraid to answer and testify of what has happened here. But the blind man does. And he stands up for him. He stands up for Christ. And he is cast out. So in other words, I think what they're saying here is he is basically excommunicated. And then interestingly enough, as the blind man sticks up for Jesus, the Pharisees say to him, thou art his disciple. But we are Moses' disciples. And we've talked about this often here. this rivalry that is happening here. And understand, this is what it is. It's not that, as we think about it, kind of like, how can you have a rivalry between Jesus and Moses? It's not their rivalry, it's the Jews' rivalry, right? They do not believe in the Son of God. They believe in Moses as the lawgiver, and that the law supersedes everything. Whereas Jesus is here saying, no, the law looks forward to a higher law and looks forward to me. So that is the rivalry. The law of Moses, the lower law, the Aaronic law, and the higher law, which the lower law is supposed to be looking forward to. You can't get rid of the lower law. It has to always be there. It is about what we do to reach up to God, right? But we have to understand that we're reaching towards something. If we're going through obedience and commandments and prayer and all these things that are a part of the lower law that we exert to be closer to God, but we don't understand that there is a reaching from Him down to us that we can believe in and that we can lean on through the sacrifice, then that lower law is completely dead. It means nothing. It doesn't matter that we even have it. It just becomes a bunch of rules. And that's what has happened here in the time of Christ. The other thing to think of is this blind man as a metaphor for the circumstances that they all find themselves in here. They're all blind. Most of them are blind. Certainly the Jews in power are blind. And Christ is coming as the light of the world, right? Opening everything up to bring everybody back to get through the ascension of the temple to the Holy of Holies, to the celestial kingdom, to understand the fullness of actually what, ironically, Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, would offer everybody. And here they're saying they are the sons of Abraham, and yet think of the whole idea of the Abrahamic covenant, of being sealed together with everyone. That is a Melchizedek law. That is something that where you need the Son of God to effectuate. And the irony is they're claiming to be sons of Abraham, and yet they are not claiming his works. That is, his teachings, his doctrine, which is about the sealing of the family and of the Son of God being the central part of that doctrine. And so the blind man, in a sense, represents the Jews here that are blind. Remember that it's Isaiah. If you go back to the words of Isaiah, he talks about those that don't have clean lips and that they will not understand and they will not see. Well, that's what the circumstances are with the Jews. When you kick out the doctrine of Christ, you get rid of that, then you are confused, you are in darkness. You do not see and you do not understand. And that's what has happened here. That's where they're at. And so the blind man here is someone who is born into blindness, just as most of these Jews have been born into blindness, spiritual blindness. But Jesus is here with the blind man. He heals him directly. But the healing would also happen spiritually with all of the Jews here if they would just stop and understand and listen and accept him and the doctrine that he is teaching. But they won't. They prefer to remain blind. They do not see that he is the light of the world. They won't look to him as the light so that they can see. And so they remain blind. It is the same idea that we get in the next chapter, in chapter 10, where we get the title of this week's Come Follow Me, which is I Am the Good Shepherd. Again here, the idea of the shepherd is something that we would basically understand. Yeah, it's someone who guides someone and leads them. Well, this is the same idea. The shepherd is an understanding of the priesthood, in a sense. And here the priesthood has been completely changed. You have Herod of the time of Jesus' birth that actually went in and put his own high priests in. You have these high priests that went out and helped stone and kill the apostles. That's who these high priests are. Remember that Saul, before he's Paul, is organizing with the high priests and the Sadducees to go and stone Stephen. And they help kill Peter. And so that's who these high priests are. These are the shepherds. And so not only is Jesus the shepherd that we should follow, the reason he's the good shepherd is because for centuries they have been guided by bad shepherds that have come in and changed the doctrine and led people astray and kept them in the dark, kept them blind. And so Jesus is restoring that guidance. He's restoring the light. He's restoring the idea that he is the one that he will lead us back to salvation through the doctrine of Christ and through the higher law. And so John brings in this temple imagery again. It is the light in the Holy of Holies that we're supposed to follow. And it is the shepherd that will guide us and bring us through to the Holy of Holies, or back to our Heavenly Father. Jesus goes and refers to these other shepherds that have been around here for centuries. He says, "All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in," so think of baptism as the gate, "he shall be saved and shall go in and out and find pasture. And the thief cometh not but for to steal." And from other writings, we know that the priests, although there were many priests that did convert to Christianity, the priests that were around there were, especially the high priests, they actually stole from the other priests. So it was very much about power, very much about greed in the priesthood at this time. He says, "I am cometh that they may have life and that they might have it more abundantly." In verse 11, then he says here, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep." So it's the exact opposite of the environment that he has entered into. We think about others that might be good shepherds to us, that are good examples to us, that would emulate Christ, or that are willing to sacrifice for those that they love. That is the path that leads us back to the light. Are we willing to be good shepherds as well? Are we willing to sacrifice to be an example? Are we willing to sacrifice to lift others up that aren't as fortunate perhaps, that don't have the same knowledge, that don't have the same experience, that haven't been introduced to the gospel, that need our help? So as Christ is the light, and as Christ is the good shepherd, we also should be a light, and we also should be a guide for those that are around us. I'll talk to you next time.